Hello, and welcome to the review of Procedure MG-O-004.02. Today, we will cover procedures related to consenting English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects. Before we begin, it is important to address why this procedure is important to clinical research. The purpose of this procedure is to establish a consistent method for the informed consent and authorization process for English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects, or the subject's legally authorized representative. Informed consent is a key element of research with human subjects, especially in vulnerable populations. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. The scope of this procedure applies to all individuals and designated research staff who have the responsibility of obtaining and documenting informed consent from living individuals involved in human subject research, or their legally authorized representative. Throughout this presentation, there are many important terms that will be utilized. Illiterate English speaking, informed consent process, and legally authorized representative are three definitions in particular that require some special attention. Illiterate English speaking is a person who speaks and understands English but does not read and write. The informed consent process is discussed in greater detail in Procedure MG-O-004.02, titled Informed Consent Process and Documentation. Legally authorized representative is an individual or judicial or any other body authorized under applicable law to consent on behalf of a prospective subject to the subject's participation in the procedure involved in the research. Additional terms that will not be defined in this training include investigator, principal investigator, research, family member, impartial witness, and institutional review board. If you are unfamiliar with any of these terms, please take a moment to pause this video and visit the MedStar Georgetown Glossary to obtain the definition of the unfamiliar terms. Informed consent is a key element of research with human subjects. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. The principal investigator and designated research staff are responsible for understanding and following the basic tenets and regulations regarding informed consent as outlined in Procedure MG-O-004.01. In the first part of this procedural review, we have introduced the purpose, scope, and responsibilities. We are now going to transition into discussing informed consent procedures related to English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects. There are some general principles in engaging English-speaking illiterate and legally blind subjects in the informed consent process. English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects are not to be excluded from the research solely based on their literacy or blindness, unless explicitly stated in the protocol. A person who can understand and comprehend spoken English but is physically unable to read or write, an illiterate person, can be entered into a study. Designated research staff and/or the investigator should not assume a subject's literacy or vision ability. Before asking a potential research subject to review and sign an informed consent form, every investigator and/or designated research staff is responsible under the informed consent process for assessing that a potential research subject is capable of reading the informed consent form. There are several ways to properly assess visual or literacy of potential subjects. Use inclusive language to start the conversation. Avoid directly asking, "Can you read?" or "Are you blind?" Instead, use language that offers assistance without implying judgment. Some examples of inclusive, non-judgmental language would be, "Would you prefer that I read the consent form aloud to you? Would you like me to explain any parts of the form?" Some people find medical forms hard to read. Would it help if I went over this with you? Offer the consent form in different formats by presenting the form and asking how the participant would like to receive the information. For example, verbally or read aloud, Braille, large print, audio recording, or digital version for screen reader access. This gives them a choice and provides indirect insight into their reading or visual ability. Observe nonverbal cues that may prompt you to offer the subject help. For example, holding the form unusually close or far, skimming without seeming to engage, avoiding written sections, or showing confusion over basic written information. Before transitioning into the informed consent process, let's address some additional general principles. If a research subject is unable to read, designated research staff and/or investigator are to make special arrangements for modification of informed consent procedures without causing embarrassment to the research subject. In order to present the consent to a subject that is legally blind or illiterate in a language understandable to the subject, alterations to the consent process will be used to ensure correct informed consent. Let's apply the visual or literacy guidelines to the following situation. As the designated research staff performing informed consent, you provide a possible research subject the informed consent form. You notice the subject brings the document close to their face and is squinting. After making these observations, you are assessing that the subject could have some visual impairment. What actions should you take? Pause the video and write down on some scratch paper procedural supported actions that could help the subject based on the discussion so far. First, don't assume the subject's vision ability and start a conversation utilizing inclusive, non-judgmental language. For example, you could say, "Some patients have found this medical form difficult to read. Would it help if I went over with you?" If the potential subject agrees to the offered support, provide them with supportive options. These could include what you may have available, such as reading the consent form aloud or providing a digital version so the subject can manipulate the form to enlarge sections of the consent form. It is important to provide options so the potential subject feels comfortable. It is important to remember that informed consent is a process. This figure represents a brief overview of the informed consent process, including the introduction, explanation, comprehension, question and answer, and consent. These steps are not different for the illiterate or legally blind participant other than including specific accommodations throughout the process. These steps are covered in detail in the Informed Consent Process and Documentation Procedure MG-O-004.02. All informed consent process components that we will discuss assumes that you have a clear understanding of these steps. If you are unsure about any of these 5 elements, please take a moment to review the procedure before continuing. There are several additional components to performing the informed consent process with English-speaking illiterate and blind subjects. It is recommended that an impartial witness observe the entire consent process. Family members are not recommended as an impartial witness. The IRB-approved consent and/or consent materials should be presented orally. Audio recordings of the informed consent form and/or informed consent discussion may be provided to the subject for their reference. If potential subjects have access to equipment, technical devices that can read the consent document to them, they should be provided enough time to read the consent form separate from the research team. Sufficient time should be allowed for questions to be asked and answered, both by the research subject and the designated research staff obtaining consent, to ensure the research subject comprehends the consent information. There are additional steps that must be taken to ensure appropriate consent signing and documentation for English-speaking illiterate and blind research subjects. Documentation of informed consent for illiterate or legally blind subjects may be modified as approved by the IRB for the subject, but overall requirements for documentation of informed consent remain. Document that the subject was unable to read the consent form and that the consent was orally presented to the research subject or the subject's legally authorized representative, and that there was a witness to the oral presentation. Ensure that an illiterate subject or a subject that speaks or understands English but does not read and or write English can be enrolled in a study by making their mark. A mark can be an X, signature, or initialing the consent document. The impartial witness signs and dates the consent form. By doing so, the witness attests the consent information was given freely. Following consent, signing, and documentation guidelines are the same as what was presented in Procedure MG-O-004.02. A signed copy of the consent form, as well as other documentation about the research, such as calendars or instructions, must be provided to the subject and/or LAR as appropriate. An original or certified copy of the entire signed consent form must be retained in the study records. The research staff performing the informed consent process must document that the process has occurred in the electronic health record, or use a narrative consent note, which should be filed together with the consent form in the study binder. One major difference in documentation of the informed consent process is the inclusion of details related to the use of implemented accommodations throughout the consent process. The same documentation information should be included in the informed consent process for English-speaking, illiterate, and legally blind participants as listed in Procedure MG-O-401. The guideline titled MG-O-4GL1, using MedConnect AutoText and PowerForms for research documentation, provides a template for documenting the informed consent process in the electronic health record. The same text can be used for a narrative note, which should be filed together with the consent form in the study binder. At times, an alternative approach may be necessary in consenting English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects. Alternative approaches may be used if they are IRB approved and if they satisfy the requirements of the applicable regulations, such as short-form consent. For more information on the IRB process, be sure to connect with the IRB of record as processes and procedures differ between various institutions and organizations. Some possible alternative approaches include the use of a short form or audio file. If short form consent documents are utilized, please reference Procedure MG-O-403 on consenting non-English speaking subjects for additional guidance on appropriate usage. Just another quick reminder to document when using alternative approaches in the consent process note. In summary, illiterate and legally blind subjects should not be excluded from enrollment unless explicitly stated in the protocol. The informed consent process steps are the same as discussed in Procedure MG-O-401. IRB approval of accommodations for legally blind and English-speaking illiterate subjects is required. Be sure to converse with the subject using inclusive, non-judgmental language and approaches throughout the informed consent process. Throughout this video, guidance on assessment of visual literacy or blindness and appropriate alternative approaches to consenting English-speaking illiterate and legally blind subjects was provided. Finally, additional consent signing and documentation requirements were discussed. This concludes the overview of Procedure MG-O-402 on consenting English-speaking illiterate and legally blind research subjects. If you would like more information on Joint GU-MHRI procedures, please visit the website shared on the screen or visit MedStar Starport. Take care!